On the rugged Isle of Berk, where the sky churns with storms and the sea crashes against jagged cliffs, dragons are more than just legend. They are the enemy. For generations, the Vikings of Berk have fought an endless war against these fearsome creatures, defending their homes with axes and fire. The village lives by a simple creed: dragons are savage beasts, and slaying them is the highest honor. But for Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III, the scrawny son of the mighty chief Stoik the Vast, life is far from heroic. Overshadowed by the warriors of Berk, Hiccup longs to prove himself worthy of his lineage. Yet his clever mind and inventive hands often cause more trouble than triumph. When Hiccup's reckless ingenuity brings down a dragon feared above all others, the elusive Night Fury, his world is turned upside down. What begins as an act of defiance transforms into a journey of discovery. In the heart of a creature he was taught to hate, Hiccup finds an unlikely friend. And in that friendship lies the power to reshape the destiny of both dragons and Vikings. This is the story of a boy, a dragon, and a bond that could bridge the divide between two warring worlds. But peace comes at a price, and Hiccup will soon learn that courage is not measured by strength alone. It is defined by the choices we make when the world stands against us. Chapter 1. Hiccup the Misfit. The island of Berk was, by all definitions, inhospitable. Jagged cliffs surrounded it like a fortress, battered relentlessly by icy winds and unyielding waves. The skies above were often darkened by rolling clouds, and the air always carried the faint scent of salt and smoke. Yet, despite its harshness, Berk was home, a home forged by generations of hardy Vikings who thrived on adversity. The people of Berk were proud, stubborn, and unyielding, much like their land. But Berk had one problem that set it apart from any other Viking village: dragons. Dragons attacked in swarms, swooping from the skies with their leathery wings and fiery breath, stealing livestock, destroying homes, and leaving chaos in their wake. For the villagers, this was just another facet of their harsh reality. For years, they had fought back with everything they had: axes, spears, nets, and sheer Viking ferocity. It was a way of life, a rite of passage. To slay a dragon was the ultimate achievement, a mark of true strength and courage. Hiccup Horrendous Haddock III, however, was neither strong nor courageous, at least not in the traditional Viking sense. At 15, Hiccup was an anomaly in his village. While the other Viking teens were broad-shouldered and battle-ready, Hiccup was lean, awkward, and clumsy. His wiry frame and lack of physical prowess earned him ridicule from his peers and exasperation from his father, Stoik the Vast, the mighty chief of Berk. Stoik was everything a Viking should be: towering, powerful, and fiercely determined. Hiccup, in contrast, was small and perpetually out of place. Even his name felt like a cosmic joke, as though fate had decided to set him apart from the moment he was born. "Move aside, Hiccup," Snotlout sneered one morning as the villagers rushed to prepare for yet another dragon raid. Snotlout was everything Hiccup wasn't: strong, boastful, and popular. He shoved Hiccup out of the way as he hefted a massive shield, his smug grin practically daring Hiccup to retaliate. Hiccup, of course, didn't. "Just stay inside where you're safe," Astrid barked as she strapped a hefty axe to her back. Her tone was curt, but her actions spoke volumes. Astrid was one of the fiercest dragon fighters among the younger Vikings, and Hiccup admired her skill and bravery, even if she barely acknowledged him. Hiccup sighed as the village erupted into a flurry of activity. Dragons were spotted in the distance, and everyone sprang into action. Nets were drawn, weapons were prepared, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Hiccup lingered at the edge of the commotion, a spectator in his own village. "Get back inside, Hiccup," Gobber bellowed. Gobber the Belch, the village blacksmith and dragon trainer, was one of the few people who tolerated Hiccup's quirks. Still, his patience had its limits, especially during a raid. "But I can help," Hiccup protested, clutching a strange contraption he had built in the forge, a bola launcher designed to take down dragons from a distance. It was his latest invention, and he was determined to prove its worth. "Hiccup," Gobber growled, "the best thing you can do is stay out of the way. Last time you tried to help, we spent 3 days rebuilding the west wall." Hiccup winced at the reminder but refused to back down. "This time will be different. I've got it all figured out." Gobber rolled his eyes but didn't argue further. The raid was starting, and there was no time to babysit the chief's wayward son. The first dragon appeared as a dark silhouette against the clouds, its wings beating rhythmically as it dove toward the village. It was followed by others, a chaotic swarm of shapes and colors that descended upon Berk like a storm. Monstrous nightmares, gronkles, natters, and terrible terrors, all with their own unique blend of firepower and fury. The villagers met them head-on, a cacophony of shouts, clanging metal and roaring flames. Hiccup darted through the chaos, his bola launcher at the ready. He dodged falling debris and dragon fire, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. He had no intention of staying out of the way this time. Then he saw it, the Night Fury. The Night Fury was a legend among dragons, whispered about in hushed tones and feared by even the bravest Vikings. It was fast, silent, and deadly, a phantom of the skies. No one had ever seen it up close, let alone brought it down. But Hiccup saw it now, a streak of shadow against the clouds. He fumbled with his launcher, his hands trembling with a mix of excitement and terror. This was his chance to prove he wasn't just a useless tag-along. He lined up his shot, took a deep breath, and fired. The bola shot through the air, trailing a cord as it flew toward its target. To Hiccup's astonishment, it hit. The Night Fury let out a screech and spiraled downward, disappearing into the forest beyond the village. Hiccup's heart raced as he stood frozen in disbelief. He had done it. He had brought down a Night Fury. But the moment was short-lived. A monstrous nightmare barreled toward him, its maw glowing with fiery breath. Hiccup yelped and scrambled for cover, narrowly avoiding the blast. The battle continued around him, and any recognition of his achievement was drowned out by the chaos. By the time the dragons retreated and the raid ended, Berk was left in smoldering ruins. Villagers surveyed the damage, groaning about lost sheep and charred rooftops. Hiccup, however, could think of only one thing, the Night Fury. He slipped away from the village unnoticed, his mind racing. He had to find it. He had to prove to everyone, especially his father, that he wasn't a failure. The forest was quiet and eerie as Hiccup searched for signs of the dragon. He followed the broken branches and disturbed undergrowth, his heart pounding with anticipation. Finally, he found it. A massive black shape sprawled on the forest floor. The Night Fury was alive but injured, its wings tangled in the bola cords. Its eyes glowed a piercing green, and it hissed weakly as Hiccup approached. Hiccup raised his knife, his hands trembling. This was it, the moment he had dreamed of, the chance to prove himself a true Viking. But as he looked into the dragon's eyes, something inside him faltered. The creature wasn't the terrifying monster he had imagined. It was scared, vulnerable, and oddly familiar. Hiccup hesitated, the knife hovering in midair. Then, with a deep breath, he lowered it. "I'm not going to hurt you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The Night Fury blinked, its hissing subsiding into a wary silence. Hiccup set to work, cutting the cords and freeing the dragon. When he was done, he stepped back, giving it space. The dragon stared at him for a long moment, then spread its wings and disappeared into the sky. Hiccup watched it go, his mind reeling. He had done something no Viking had ever done before, not just seeing a Night Fury, but sparing its life. As he trudged back to the village, he couldn't help but feel that everything he thought he knew about dragons, and himself, was about to change. Chapter 2: The Night Fury. The morning after the dragon raid, Berk was already alive with the sounds of rebuilding. Hammers rang out as villagers patched roofs and reinforced walls. The air smelled of charred wood and seawater, mingling with the ever-present chill. Hiccup shuffled through the chaos, clutching a basket of nails and tools. It was busy work, a way to keep him out of trouble, and more importantly, out of sight. "Morning, Hiccup," Gobber called, his booming voice cutting through the din. "Don't suppose you're planning to accidentally take down the rest of the forest today, are you?" Hiccup forced a grin. No promises. Despite Gobber's teasing, Hiccup's mind was elsewhere. He couldn't stop thinking about what had happened in the forest. He had shot down a Night Fury. That should have been the most important moment of his life, the moment that turned him from a walking embarrassment into a hero. But instead of slaying the dragon, he'd let it go. Why? He didn't have an answer. All he knew was that when he had looked into its eyes, he had seen something he hadn't expected: fear. Not the kind of fear that came from pain or danger, but a deeper fear, a fear he recognized. It had felt so human. Hiccup's train of thought was interrupted by Stoik's commanding voice booming across the square. "Listen up," his father barked. "We've got repairs to make, stores to replenish, and defenses to reinforce. Dragons don't take holidays, and neither do we." The villagers roared their agreement, their voices a chorus of determination. Hiccup lingered at the edge of the crowd, trying not to draw attention to himself. Stoic's eyes swept over the gathered Vikings, and for a moment, they landed on Hiccup. The look was brief but heavy. Disappointment, frustration. Stoic didn't have to say a word for Hiccup to feel the weight of his expectations. Hiccup turned away and slipped out of the square, his basket of nails forgotten. He needed to think. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt alive. Every rustle of leaves, every chirp of a bird, every distant crack of a branch felt like a reminder that something was always moving, always watching. Hiccup's feet carried him back to the spot where he had found the night fury, though he wasn't entirely sure why. The clearing looked different in the daylight. The broken branches and trampled undergrowth told the story of a struggle, but there was no sign of the dragon. Hiccup scanned the area, his eyes darting from tree to tree. And then he saw it. A faint trail of scorched grass led deeper into the woods. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Hiccup followed it, his heart pounding with a mix of fear and curiosity. He didn't know what he was expecting to find, if the night fury was even still alive, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to know. The trail led him to a rocky outcrop overlooking a secluded cove. It was a beautiful, hidden place, the kind of spot that felt untouched by the chaos of the outside world. And there, lying in the shade of a large boulder, was the night fury. Hiccup froze. The dragon's black scales shimmered in the dappled sunlight, and its wings lay folded against its sides. It was breathing heavily, its chest rising and falling in uneven rhythms. One of its wings was bent at an awkward angle, the result of its crash landing. For a moment, Hiccup considered turning back. He had no idea what he was doing here, but something about the dragon held him in place. It wasn't just the fact that it was a night fury, the rarest and most feared of dragons. It was the vulnerability in its posture, the way it curled its tail around itself like a wounded animal. Slowly, cautiously, Hiccup stepped forward. The dragon's head snapped up, its eyes locking onto him. Its pupils narrowed to slits, and it let out a low, guttural growl. "Hey, hey," Hiccup said, holding up his hands. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." The dragon didn't move, but its growl softened slightly. Hiccup crouched down, making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. "You don't remember me, do you? I'm the guy who shot you down. But I also let you go, so maybe we can call it even." The dragon tilted its head, its expression unreadable. Taking a deep breath, Hiccup reached into his satchel and pulled out a piece of fish he had swiped from the village earlier. He held it out, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. "Here, peace offering." The dragon sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring. It eyed the fish warily, then shifted its gaze back to Hiccup. "It's not poisoned, I swear," Hiccup said, his voice trembling slightly. "You'd probably be able to tell if it was anyway, right? You've got those big, dragon senses." After a long, tense moment, the dragon leaned forward and snatched the fish from Hiccup's hand. Its sharp teeth made quick work of the meal, and Hiccup couldn't help but smile. "There you go," he said. "See? Not so bad." The dragon licked its chops and looked at him again, its gaze softer now. Hiccup took a step closer, his confidence growing. "So, I guess this makes us acquaintances? Friends might be a bit of a stretch, but we're getting there." He reached out a hand, stopping just short of touching the dragon's snout. The dragon sniffed his fingers, its warm breath tickling his skin. Then, to Hiccup's astonishment, it nudged his hand with its nose. Hiccup felt a surge of emotion, relief, excitement, and something he couldn't quite put into words. This wasn't just a dragon. This was something more. "Okay," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You need a name. I can't keep calling you Night Fury. Let's see." He studied the dragon, taking in its sleek black scales and piercing green eyes. "Toothless," he said finally with a small laugh. "Because, your teeth disappear when you're not trying to eat me." Toothless snorted, a sound that Hiccup could almost swear was amusement. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Hiccup stayed in the cove, watching Toothless and trying to understand him. He noticed the way the dragon moved, the way it tilted its head when curious, the way its tail twitched when it was annoyed. By the time the sun began to set, Hiccup felt like he had learned more about dragons in a single day than in all the years he had spent listening to the village's stories. As he made his way back to Berk, his mind buzzed with ideas. This wasn't just about Toothless. This was about all dragons. If one Night Fury could be misunderstood, maybe they all were. But convincing the rest of the village would be another matter entirely. Chapter 3. Forbidden Friendship. The days after Hiccup's discovery of Toothless were a whirlwind of secrecy and transformation. He woke each morning before the village stirred, sneaking out under the pretense of early chores or repairing another imaginary, Hiccup-sized disaster. His true destination, however, was the hidden cove where the night fury waited. It had taken several visits for Toothless to fully trust him. At first, their interactions were brief and cautious. Hiccup would leave fish, observe from a distance, and talk in a quiet, rambling way that seemed to put them both at ease. Over time, Toothless began to approach him willingly, nudging his hand in greeting or flicking his tail in a playful challenge. Hiccup's fascination with the dragon only grew. Everything about Toothless defied the stories he had been told. The creature wasn't a mindless, bloodthirsty beast. It was curious, intelligent, and at times, almost comically expressive. Toothless had moods, preferences, and quirks that felt more like a person's than an animal's. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the trees, Hiccup arrived at the cove to find Toothless sprawled on the grass, his wings stretched lazily. The dragon perked up at the sound of Hiccup's approach, chuffing softly in greeting. "Morning, bud," Hiccup said, grinning. He set down the satchel slung over his shoulder, revealing a collection of fish, tools, and scraps of leather. "Brought breakfast. And, well, a little something extra." Toothless sniffed the satchel, his eyes lighting up at the smell of fish. He dug in eagerly, his tail thumping against the ground. Hiccup chuckled, sitting cross-legged a few feet away. "I've been thinking," he began, pulling out a sketchbook filled with scribbled diagrams and notes. "About your tail. I mean, it's kind of a problem, right? You can't fly without it, and flying is sort of your whole thing." Toothless paused mid-chew, his ears twitching. He tilted his head, clearly listening. "So," Hiccup continued, flipping to a detailed drawing of a prosthetic tail fin, "I figured, why not try to fix it? I mean, I'm not exactly an expert, but I've got Gobber's Forge and a lot of free time." Toothless blinked, his gaze shifting between Hiccup and the drawing. "Look, I know it's risky," Hiccup said quickly, holding up his hands. "You don't have to trust me or anything. But if it works, well, it might be worth a shot, right?" For a long moment, Toothless stared at him, his green eyes unblinking. Then, with a soft huff, the dragon stretched out his damaged tail toward Hiccup. Hiccup's breath caught. It wasn't just a gesture of cooperation, it was trust. "Okay," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Okay, let's do this." The work was slow and painstaking. Hiccup measured, sketched, and experimented with different materials, all while keeping a close eye on Toothless' reactions. The dragon was surprisingly patient, though he occasionally growled in frustration when Hiccup fumbled or made an adjustment that didn't sit right. By the end of the day, the first version of the prosthetic was ready. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was a start. "All right, bud," Hiccup said, fastening the device to Toothless' tail. Moment of truth. Toothless flexed his wings, testing the weight of the new fin. Hiccup held his breath as the dragon launched himself into the air, his powerful wings stirring the grass and leaves below. For a few glorious seconds, Toothless soared, his movements smooth and confident. But then, as he tried to bank left, the prosthetic fin faltered. Toothless let out a startled roar as he plummeted back to the ground, landing in an awkward heap. "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" Hiccup exclaimed, running to his side. "Are you okay?" "That was my fault. I didn't balance it right." "Hold on, I'll fix it." Toothless grumbled, but he didn't pull away as Hiccup inspected the fin. "That was still pretty good, though," Hiccup said, trying to stay optimistic. "We're getting closer. Just need to tweak a few things." It took days, weeks even, of trial and error, but eventually they found a system that worked. The final version of the prosthetic was controlled by a simple mechanism that allowed Hiccup to adjust the angle of the fin while riding. Their first successful flight was a moment neither of them would ever forget. Hiccup climbed onto Toothless' back, his hands trembling as he gripped the harness he had built. "Okay, bud," he said, his voice shaky. "Let's try this again. Nice and easy." Toothless snorted, his wings spreading wide. And then they were off. The world blurred around them as Toothless shot into the sky, his wings slicing through the air with effortless grace. Hiccup felt his stomach drop, a mix of terror and exhilaration washing over him. "Whoa!" he shouted, laughing despite himself. "This is amazing." Toothless let out a triumphant roar, diving and weaving through the clouds. Hiccup leaned into the movements, adjusting the fin as they turned and looped. For the first time, they weren't just two mismatched beings trying to figure each other out. They were a team. When they finally landed back in the cove, both of them were breathless and grinning. We did it, Hiccup said, sliding off Toothless' back. We actually did it. Toothless nuzzled him affectionately, his eyes bright with excitement. From that day on, their bond grew even stronger. They spent hours exploring the skies, testing Toothless' limits and discovering the hidden beauty of Berk from above. Hiccup learned to trust his instincts, while Toothless seemed to thrive under the freedom their partnership offered. But their secret friendship wasn't without its challenges. Hiccup had to be careful not to arouse suspicion, especially with Stoik and Gobber keeping a close eye on him. He spent his nights in the forge, pretending to work on village repairs while secretly refining his designs for Toothless' harness. Meanwhile, his dragon training sessions with Gobber and the other teens became increasingly complicated. Using what he had learned from Toothless, Hiccup began to approach the dragons in the training arena differently. Instead of fighting them, he observed them. He noticed how their body language changed when they felt threatened, how they responded to certain gestures or sounds. Bit by bit, he started to gain their trust. The first time he calmed a natter by offering it a fish, the other trainees were stunned. "How did you do that?" Astrid demanded, her blue eyes narrowing suspiciously. "A lucky guess?" Hiccup said, his voice cracking slightly. Astrid didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. Hiccup's unorthodox methods quickly set him apart from the others. While Snotlout, Roughnut, Toughnut, and Fishlegs relied on brute force or sheer luck, Hiccup managed to outmaneuver and outthink the dragons without ever raising a weapon. Word of his success began to spread, earning him grudging respect from the other teens, and wary attention from Gobber and Stoik. "What's gotten into you, lad?" Gobber asked one evening, watching as Hiccup deftly avoided a Gronkle's fiery breath. "You've gone from the village disaster to dragon whisperer overnight." Hiccup shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Just paying attention, I guess." Gobber raised an eyebrow but said nothing more. Stoik, however, was less easily satisfied. "You're hiding something," he said one night after dinner, his deep voice laced with suspicion. "I can see it in your eyes." "I'm not hiding anything," Hiccup insisted, his stomach twisting into knots. "Don't lie to me, boy," Stoik growled. "If you know something that could help us fight these dragons, you need to speak up." Hiccup avoided his father's gaze, the weight of his secret pressing heavily on his chest. He knew he couldn't keep his friendship with Toothless hidden forever. But the thought of what would happen if the village found out, if Stoik found out, terrified him. For now, all he could do was hope that the bond he had forged with the Night Fury would be enough to change everything. Chapter 4. Secrets Unveiled. Hiccup's routine of secrecy had become a balancing act as delicate as the prosthetic fin he had built for Toothless. Each day felt like a race against suspicion, with Hiccup juggling his duties, his training, and his stolen hours in the hidden cove. Toothless, for his part, seemed blissfully unaware of the growing tension in Hiccup's life. The dragon thrived on their daily flights, bounding through the skies with an exhilaration that was impossible not to share. Hiccup had never felt more alive than when they soared together, the wind rushing past them as Berk became a speck in the distance. But the walls of Hiccup's carefully constructed world were closing in. The other teens had started to notice his strange behavior. Astrid, sharp-eyed and relentless, was the first to voice her suspicions. "You're hiding something," she said one afternoon, cornering him after training. Her axe rested on her shoulder, but the look in her eyes was sharper than any blade. "What? Me? Hiding? No way," Hiccup stammered, his voice rising an octave. Astrid narrowed her eyes. "You've been sneaking off every chance you get. And suddenly, you're some kind of dragon expert? It doesn't add up, Hiccup." "Maybe I've just been paying attention," he said, forcing a smile. Astrid didn't look convinced. The pressure from his father was even worse. Stoik had grown increasingly frustrated with the dragon's relentless raids, and his temper was shorter than ever. Every conversation with Hiccup seemed to turn into a lecture about duty, legacy, and the importance of being a proper Viking. "You've been doing well in training," Stoik said one evening, his tone gruff but approving. "Gobber says you've got a knack for handling dragons." Hiccup shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, I guess I've been figuring a few things out." "Good," Stoik said, leaning closer. "Because we're running out of time. The dragons are getting bolder, and we need to find their nest before it's too late." Hiccup's stomach sank. The idea of leading the village to the dragon's nest filled him with dread. He had seen the way Toothless reacted to threats, the fear and pain that flashed in his eyes when he thought he was in danger. If the village attacked, it would be a massacre. "I'll keep working on it," Hiccup said weakly. "See that you do," Stoic replied, his gaze heavy with expectation. As the days passed, Hiccup's bond with Toothless grew stronger. They communicated in a language of gestures and expressions, a silent understanding that needed no words. Toothless had started to anticipate Hiccup's movements during their flights, responding to subtle shifts in his weight with precise adjustments. It was during one of these flights that Hiccup's worst fear came true. They were skimming low over the forest, the sunlight filtering through the trees in golden beams. Hiccup leaned forward, guiding Toothless into a tight spiral that left them both laughing. Well, Hiccup was laughing. Toothless let out a delighted series of warbles. Suddenly, Toothless stiffened, his head snapping toward a movement in the trees. Hiccup followed his gaze and felt his heart stop. Astrid. She stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, her axe in hand, her mouth agape. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a growl, Toothless spread his wings, shielding Hiccup from view. No, 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 Hiccup said, scrambling off the dragon's back. It's okay, bud. She's not going to hurt us. Toothless didn't relax, his pupils narrowing as he kept his eyes on Astrid. Hiccup, Astrid said, her voice trembling. What is that? Oh, well, Hiccup hesitated, glancing at Toothless. This is Toothless. He's, my dragon. You're what? Hiccup held up his hands. Look, I can explain. Before he could finish, Astrid turned and bolted. Wait, Hiccup shouted, running after her. Astrid, stop. Toothless let out a frustrated snarl but stayed behind, his gaze wary. Hiccup caught up to Astrid just as she reached the edge of the forest. He grabbed her arm, spinning her around to face him. Let go of me, she snapped, yanking her arm free. Just listen, Hiccup pleaded. It's not what you think. Not what I think. Hiccup, that's a night fury. The most dangerous dragon there is. He's not dangerous, Hiccup said desperately. He's different. He's smart and kind, and he's a dragon. Astrid interrupted. Do you have any idea what would happen if the village found out about this? Your father. I know, Hiccup said, his voice breaking. But I couldn't kill him, Astrid. I couldn't. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was just scared. Astrid stared at him, her expression unreadable. You don't understand, Hiccup continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. Everything we've been told about dragons, it's all wrong. They're not monsters. They're just trying to survive like us. Astrid's grip on her axe tightened, but she didn't raise it. How do you know that? Because I've seen it, Hiccup said, his voice softening. Toothless isn't the only one. I've been watching the dragons in training. They're not mindless killers. They're just scared and confused. Astrid hesitated, her eyes searching his. If you're wrong about this. I'm not, Hiccup said firmly. Please, Astrid. Just give me a chance to prove it. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a reluctant sigh, she lowered her axe. This is insane, she muttered. Thank you, Hiccup said, relief flooding through him. Astrid followed him back to the cove, her movements stiff and wary. Toothless growled when he saw her, his wings flaring. It's okay, bud, Hiccup said, stepping between them. She's with me. Toothless didn't look convinced, but he allowed Hiccup to approach. This is Toothless, Hiccup said, gesturing to the dragon. He's a night fury, but he's not like the others. He's my friend. Astrid stared at Toothless, her expression a mix of awe and disbelief. Hiccup spent the next hour explaining everything. How he had found Toothless, how he had built the prosthetic tail, and how they had learned to fly together. He showed Astrid the sketches and notes he had been keeping, detailing everything he had learned about dragons. By the time he finished, Astrid's skepticism had softened into something closer to understanding. This is a lot, she said finally. But if you're right, if dragons really aren't the enemy. They're not, Hiccup said firmly. And I think I know how to prove it. Astrid frowned. How? Hiccup hesitated. He had been dreading this moment, but there was no turning back now. I'm going to find the dragon's nest, he said. And I'm going to show the village what's really going on. Astrid's eyes widened. Hiccup, that's suicide. You have no idea what's out there. I have Toothless, Hiccup said, glancing at the dragon. And he has me. We can do this, Astrid. We have to. Astrid looked at him, then at Toothless. Finally, she nodded. Okay, she said. But if you're doing this, you're not doing it alone. Hiccup smiled, a flicker of hope lighting his chest. Thanks, Astrid. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the three of them, Hiccup, Astrid, and Toothless, stood together in the fading light, united by a secret that could change everything. Chapter 5. Into the Unknown. The morning came far too quickly, and with it, the weight of their decision pressed heavily on Hiccup's chest. The plan was simple in theory. Take Toothless, find the dragon's nest, and return with proof that would change the way Berk saw dragons forever. Simple, but perilous. Astrid's presence added an unpredictable layer, but Hiccup had to admit it was comforting to have her along, if only to reassure him that he wasn't entirely crazy. The cove was bathed in soft, golden light as Hiccup and Astrid made their final preparations. Toothless, as always, seemed eager for adventure, his tail flicking back and forth with barely restrained energy. Astrid, on the other hand, looked tense, her fingers gripping her axe tightly. "Are you sure about this?" she asked for what felt like the 10th time. "No," Hiccup admitted, adjusting the straps on Toothless' saddle. "But we don't have a choice. If we don't do this, the village is going to keep fighting dragons, and nothing will ever change." Astrid sighed, shaking her head. "You know this could go horribly wrong, right?" "Yeah," Hiccup said, his voice quieter. "I know." Astrid studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Okay, let's do this." Getting Astrid onto Toothless was an ordeal in itself. The dragon wasn't thrilled about carrying an extra passenger, especially one who had spent her life hunting his kind. Toothless growled low in his throat, his green eyes narrowing as Astrid climbed onto his back behind Hiccup. "Relax, bud," Hiccup said, patting Toothless' neck. "She's on our side now." Toothless didn't look convinced, but he tolerated Astrid's presence barely. "Ready?" Hiccup asked, glancing back at Astrid. "No," she said, gripping the saddle tightly. "But let's go anyway." Hiccup gave Toothless a gentle nudge, and the dragon launched into the air with a powerful sweep of his wings. Astrid let out a startled yelp, clutching Hiccup's waist as they climbed higher and higher. "Okay, this is insane," she shouted over the wind. "Welcome to my life," Hiccup called back, grinning despite his nerves. The world below shrank away as they soared above the forest, the village of Berk fading into the distance. Toothless flew with effortless grace, his wings cutting through the air with barely a sound. Hiccup leaned into the movements, his hands steady on the controls of the prosthetic tail. Astrid, however, was far less comfortable. She clung to Hiccup like her life depended on it, her eyes wide as they dipped and turned. "How do you even do this?" she demanded. "It's all about trust," Hiccup said. "Toothless knows what he's doing. You just have to let him take the lead." Astrid muttered something that sounded suspiciously like easier said than done, but she loosened her grip slightly. The journey to the dragon's nest was long and treacherous. Hiccup had no clear idea where it was, only vague impressions from the raids and the stories the villagers told. He relied on Toothless' instincts, trusting the dragon to guide them. As they flew farther from Berk, the landscape changed. The familiar forests and rocky cliffs gave way to jagged peaks and dark, mist-shrouded valleys. The air grew colder, and the wind carried an eerie stillness that made Hiccup's skin prickle. "We're getting close," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "How can you tell?" Astrid asked, her tone skeptical. "Just a feeling," Hiccup admitted. Toothless suddenly growled, his ears flattening against his head. Hiccup tensed, glancing around. "What is it, bud?" Before he could get an answer, a shadow passed overhead. Hiccup looked up and felt his heart skip a beat. Dragons. A swarm of them, their shapes silhouetted against the pale sky. There were natters, gronkles, zipplebacks, and even a monstrous nightmare, their wings beating in unison as they flew toward a massive volcanic island in the distance. "That has to be it," Hiccup said, pointing. Astrid's grip on his waist tightened. "And what's your plan when we get there?" Improvise?" "Great," Astrid muttered. "This just keeps getting better." Toothless followed the swarm, keeping a safe distance. The volcanic island loomed closer, its jagged cliffs rising like teeth from the churning sea. Smoke billowed from the crater at its center, mingling with the clouds to create an ominous haze. As they neared the island, Hiccup's excitement gave way to unease. The dragons were descending into a massive cavern at the heart of the volcano, their cries echoing through the air. Toothless landed on a rocky outcrop overlooking the cavern, his body tense and alert. Hiccup and Astrid dismounted, crouching low to avoid being seen. "This is it," Hiccup whispered, peering into the cavern. The dragon's nest. The sight before them was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The cavern was enormous, its walls lined with glowing magma flows that cast an eerie red light. Hundreds of dragons filled the space, their movements chaotic but strangely coordinated. They were carrying food, fish, livestock, and even barrels of grain, into the cavern, dropping it into a massive pit at its center. "What are they doing?" Astrid asked, her voice hushed. Hiccup frowned, his gaze fixed on the pit. "I don't know, but it looks like they're feeding something." As if in response to his words, a deep, guttural growl rumbled through the cavern. The dragons scattered, their cries turning to shrieks of fear. Hiccup and Astrid froze as a massive shape emerged from the shadows. It was unlike any dragon they had ever seen. Its body was enormous, its scales a dark, metallic black that shimmered in the light of the magma. Its wings were tattered but powerful, and its eyes burned with an unnatural red glow. "What is that?" Astrid whispered, her voice trembling. Hiccup swallowed hard. "The Alpha. It must be the one controlling them." The Alpha let out a deafening roar, its massive jaws snapping as it devoured the offerings the smaller dragons had brought. The sound reverberated through the cavern, shaking the very ground beneath them. "We need to get out of here," Astrid said urgently. "Not yet," Hiccup said, his eyes locked on the Alpha. "If we can figure out how it's controlling them, we'll be dead before we figure anything out." Astrid hissed. Toothless growled softly, his tail flicking in agitation. Hiccup knew she was right. Staying any longer was too dangerous. "Okay," he said reluctantly. "Let's go." They climbed back onto Toothless, keeping low as they prepared to take off. But as they rose into the air, the Alpha's head snapped toward them. It roared, and the cavern erupted into chaos. Dragons swarmed toward them, their cries a cacophony of panic and rage. "Hang on!" Hiccup shouted as Toothless dove, weaving through the oncoming swarm. Astrid screamed, clutching Hiccup tightly as they dodged fireballs and snapping jaws. Toothless moved with incredible speed and precision, his instincts and Hiccup's guidance keeping them just ahead of their pursuers. The Alpha roared again, its massive wings unfurling as it launched itself into the air. "Oh, this is bad," Hiccup muttered. "This is really bad." Toothless shot out of the cavern, the wind whipping around them as they soared over the volcanic cliffs. The Alpha followed, its enormous shadow blotting out the sun. "We're not going to outrun it," Astrid shouted. "We don't have to," Hiccup said, his mind racing. "We just need to outthink it." He guided Toothless toward a narrow canyon, its walls jagged and sharp. The Alpha followed, its massive size making it difficult to navigate the tight space. "Come on, bud," Hiccup said, urging Toothless to climb higher. The canyon narrowed even further, forcing the Alpha to slow. Toothless shot upward, bursting out of the canyon just as the Alpha's wings clipped the walls. The massive dragon let out a furious roar, struggling to free itself. "We did it," Astrid shouted, her voice filled with relief. Hiccup grinned, adrenaline coursing through him. "Yeah, we did." As they flew back toward Berk, the volcanic island fading into the distance, Hiccup couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They had seen the truth about the dragons, and now they had a chance to change everything. Chapter 6: Tides of Change. The journey back to Berk was tense and silent, save for the rhythmic beats of Toothless' wings. Astrid clung tightly to Hiccup, her thoughts swirling as chaotically as the winds that lashed at them. Hiccup felt her tension through the subtle shifts in her grip, the rigidity of her posture. Toothless, though typically smooth and steady, flew with a tautness that mirrored the mood of his riders. The image of the Alpha dragon loomed in Hiccup's mind, its sheer size and malevolence an overwhelming presence. It wasn't just a dragon, it was a force of nature, an apex predator with the power to dominate an entire species. He knew that returning to Berk meant more than just revealing what they had seen. It meant convincing the village to face a truth they had fought to deny for generations. As the familiar cliffs of Berk came into view, Astrid finally broke the silence. "Hiccup," she began, her voice uncertain. "How are we going to explain this?" "I've been asking myself that for hours," Hiccup replied, trying to keep his tone light, but failing to hide the undercurrent of worry. "You're serious about this? About telling everyone?" "We have to," Hiccup said, glancing back at her. "If we don't, the raids will never stop. And now that we know what's really going on, we can't just ignore it." Astrid sighed, tightening her grip on his waist. "You're braver than I thought, Hiccup. Or crazier. Probably both," Hiccup said with a weak smile. They landed in the forest just outside the village, keeping Toothless hidden from view. Hiccup slid off the dragon's back and turned to Astrid. "Stay here with him," he said. "What? No way," Astrid protested. "Please, Astrid," Hiccup said, his tone pleading. "If things go south, I need to know Toothless is safe. You're the only one I trust to protect him." Astrid hesitated, her expression conflicted. Finally, she nodded. Fine. But if you take too long, I'm coming after you. Fair enough, Hiccup said, managing a small smile. He patted Toothless on the snout. I'll be back soon, bud. Promise. Toothless warbled softly, his eyes filled with concern. Hiccup took a deep breath and headed toward the village, his heart pounding with every step. The village square was bustling when Hiccup arrived, the usual mix of laughter and arguments creating a familiar backdrop. But as he walked through the crowd, a hush began to fall. People turned to stare, their conversations faltering. Hiccup! Gobber's voice rang out as the blacksmith approached, his one good hand resting on his hip. Where have you been, lad? Your father's been looking for you. Perfect, Hiccup muttered under his breath. Gobber frowned. Something wrong? Where is he? Hiccup asked. In the great hall, Gobber said, his tone wary. Hiccup nodded and made his way to the hall, ignoring the curious glances and whispers that followed him. Stoik was seated at the head of the long table, flanked by several of Berk's elders. They were deep in discussion, their voices low and serious, but they fell silent as Hiccup entered. Hiccup, Stoik said, his expression a mix of relief and frustration. Where have you been? We've been. Dad, we need to talk, Hiccup interrupted, his voice steady despite the nervous knot in his stomach. Stoik raised an eyebrow. This isn't the time for interruptions, boy. It's important, Hiccup said, his gaze unwavering. It's about the dragons. The room fell silent. Stoik leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. What about them? Hiccup took a deep breath, steadying himself. They're not what we think they are. The elders exchanged puzzled glances. Explain, Stoik said, his tone heavy with skepticism. Hiccup launched into his explanation, recounting everything he had discovered. His first encounter with Toothless, the bond they had formed, the things he had learned about dragon behavior. He described the dragon's nest, the alpha, and the way the smaller dragons seemed to be controlled by it. By the time he finished, the room was silent again, but this time the air was thick with disbelief. Hiccup, Stoik said, his voice low and dangerous. Do you have any idea what you're saying? Yes, Hiccup said firmly. I'm saying we've been wrong about dragons. They're not our enemies. They're just trying to survive. Stoik's expression darkened. You expect us to believe that a night fury, the most dangerous dragon there is, befriended you? Yes, Hiccup said, his voice rising. Because I didn't try to kill him. And he didn't try to kill me. He's not a monster, Dad. None of them are. The elders murmured among themselves, their faces a mix of confusion and doubt. You've always had your head in the clouds, boy, Stoik said, his tone harsh. But this is madness. It's not madness, Hiccup said, his frustration boiling over. It's the truth. And if you don't believe me, then come and see for yourself. Stoik's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? I have proof, Hiccup said. Just follow me. Hiccup led the group to the edge of the forest, his heart pounding with every step. He glanced over his shoulder, noting the skeptical faces of the villagers who had followed them. When they reached the clearing, Hiccup turned to Astrid, who stepped forward with a wary glance at Stoik. It's okay, Hiccup said softly. Bring him out. Astrid nodded and disappeared into the trees. Moments later, Toothless emerged, his sleek black form moving cautiously into the open. The crowd gasped, several villagers stepping back in fear. By Thor's hammer, someone muttered. Toothless paused, his head low, his eyes darting nervously between the villagers. This is Toothless, Hiccup said, stepping between the dragon and the crowd. He's a night fury. And he's my friend. Stoik's face turned red, his fists clenching. What in Odin's name have you done, boy? I saved him, Hiccup said, his voice steady. And he saved me. He's not the enemy, Dad. None of them are. Stoik took a step forward, his hand moving to the axe at his side. No, Hiccup said, holding up his hands. Please just watch. He turned to Toothless, his heart racing. It's okay, bud. Show them. Toothless hesitated, then let out a soft purr, lowering his head to nuzzle Hiccup's shoulder. The crowd murmured in astonishment. He's not dangerous, Hiccup said, his voice loud and clear. He's just scared. Like all the dragons. Stoik stared at Toothless, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. If what you're saying is true, he said slowly, then why do they attack us? Hiccup hesitated, glancing at Astrid. They're being controlled, Astrid said, stepping forward. By an alpha dragon. It forces them to bring it food. They're not raiding because they want to. They're doing it because they have to. The crowd erupted into whispers, the tension thick in the air. And you think you can stop this alpha? Stoik asked, his gaze piercing. We have to try, Hiccup said. If we don't, the fighting will never end. Stoik was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to the crowd. Prepare the ships, he said. We're going to the nest. Hiccup's heart sank. He had hoped to convince them to approach the dragons with understanding, not weapons. But as the villagers scattered to make preparations, he realized that the only way to change their minds was to show them the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. Toothless growled softly, pressing his head against Hiccup's shoulder. It's going to be okay, bud, Hiccup said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. Astrid stepped up beside him, her expression grim. You ready for this? She asked. No, Hiccup admitted. But I'm not giving up now. As the sun set over Berk, Hiccup and Toothless stood together, their shadows long against the ground. The battle ahead would be unlike anything they had faced before, but Hiccup knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't face it alone. Chapter 7. The Brink of War. The first light of dawn crept across the village, turning the frost-kissed roofs of Berk a brilliant gold. The air was alive with the sounds of preparation. Hammers striking iron, the clatter of weapons being gathered, and the low murmur of voices as the villagers readied themselves for battle. Stoik had made his decree, and there was no turning back now. Hiccup stood on the edge of the village, watching the flurry of activity with a sinking feeling in his chest. Toothless was by his side, his tail swishing back and forth nervously. The night fury had picked up on the tension in the air, his luminous green eyes darting from Hiccup to the villagers and back again. We're really doing this, Hiccup muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Astrid appeared at his side, her axe resting on her shoulder. Her expression was unreadable, but her voice was steady. They're scared, Hiccup. This is how they know to fight back. I just wish there was another way, Hiccup said, running a hand through his hair. They're going into this blind. They don't know what they're up against. That's why you need to lead them, Astrid said firmly. Hiccup blinked at her. Me? Led them? Astrid, I can barely get my dad to listen to me. How am I supposed to convince an entire village to trust a dragon? You've already started, Astrid pointed out. You brought Toothless here. You showed them that not all dragons are monsters. They might not be ready to admit it yet, but you've planted the seed. Now you just have to see it through. Hiccup sighed, his gaze shifting to the ships being loaded with supplies. I don't know if I'm ready for this. Astrid placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch surprisingly gentle. No one's ever ready, Hiccup. But you've got something none of them have, the truth. And that's worth fighting for. By mid-morning, the fleet was ready. 3 longships sat in the harbor, their sails emblazoned with the symbol of Berk. The villagers gathered on the docks, armed and armored for war. The mood was somber, the usual camaraderie and banter replaced with quiet determination. Stoik stood at the head of the largest ship, his massive frame clad in heavy furs and armor. He looked every bit the chief, his jaw set in a grim line as he surveyed his people. Hiccup approached him cautiously, Toothless trailing behind. The villagers nearest to them fell silent, their eyes wide as they took in the sight of the night fury. Stoik's gaze shifted to Hiccup, his expression unreadable. You're coming, then? Yes, Hiccup said, his voice steady despite the knot of nerves in his stomach. You'll need me if you want to survive this. Stoik raised an eyebrow. And what makes you think you know more about surviving than the rest of us? Because I've seen it, Hiccup said, meeting his father's gaze. I've seen the Alpha. I've seen what it can do. And I've seen what happens when we attack without understanding what we're dealing with. Stoik studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. But if you're coming, you follow my orders. Understood. Hiccup hesitated, then nodded. Understood. Stoik's gaze shifted to Toothless. And the dragon? He's with me, Hiccup said firmly. You'll need him too. Stoik's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Get on board, he said gruffly. The journey to the dragon's nest was tense and uneventful. The villagers were wary of Toothless, giving him a wide berth whenever he moved across the deck. Hiccup stayed close to the dragon, his presence a reassurance to both Toothless and the crew. Astrid joined him at the bow of the ship, her expression thoughtful as she gazed out at the open sea. Do you think this is going to work? She asked after a long silence. Hiccup shrugged. I don't know, but it's our only shot. Astrid nodded, her grip tightening on the haft of her axe. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing, even if it doesn't feel like it. Hiccup smiled faintly. Thanks, Astrid. The volcanic island loomed on the horizon by late afternoon, its jagged peaks shrouded in smoke. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of sulfur, and the distant cries of dragons carried on the wind. The ships anchored in a sheltered cove, hidden from view by the rocky cliffs. The villagers disembarked cautiously, their weapons drawn as they scanned the terrain for threats. Hiccup led the way, Toothless at his side. Astrid followed closely, her axe at the ready. Stoik brought up the rear, his presence a reassuring anchor for the nervous villagers. As they approached the entrance to the cavern, Hiccup held up a hand, signaling for the group to stop. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "The dragon's nest." Stoik frowned. "What's the plan?" Hiccup hesitated. He had spent the entire journey thinking about this moment, but now that it was here, his mind was blank. "We need to see what we're dealing with before we do anything," he said finally. "If we charge in without a plan, we're all dead." Stoik nodded reluctantly. "All right, lead the way." The cavern was just as Hiccup remembered it, enormous, glowing with the eerie red light of molten lava. Dragons of all shapes and sizes moved through the space, their cries echoing off the walls. The villagers froze at the sight, their fear palpable. "Stay calm," Hiccup said, his voice barely above a whisper. Toothless growled softly, his ears flattening against his head. Hiccup followed the dragon's gaze to the massive pit at the center of the cavern. The alpha was there, its enormous form hunched over the offerings the smaller dragons had brought. Its scales glinted like molten metal, and its glowing red eyes scanned the cavern with a predatory intensity. Stoik's eyes widened at the sight. "Thor's beard. This is what we're up against," Hiccup said quietly. "That thing is controlling all of them." The alpha let out a deep, rumbling growl, and the smaller dragons scattered in fear. Stoik tightened his grip on his axe. "If we take it down, the rest will fall in line." "It's not that simple," Hiccup said urgently. "If you attack it, the other dragons will defend it. They don't have a choice." "Then what do you suggest?" Stoik demanded. Hiccup hesitated, his mind racing. "We need to distract it. If we can draw its attention away from the other dragons, maybe we can break its control." "And how do you plan to do that?" Astrid asked. Hiccup turned to Toothless, his heart pounding. "With him." The villagers murmured in alarm, their eyes darting between Hiccup and the Night Fury. "Hiccup, no," Stoik said, his voice firm. "It's the only way," Hiccup said. "Toothless, and I can draw the alpha out of the cavern. Once it's outside, the rest of you can." "No," Stoik interrupted. "I won't let you risk your life for this." "I'm not asking for permission," Hiccup said, his voice steady. "This is what I have to do." Before anyone could stop him, Hiccup climbed onto Toothless' back. "Hiccup, wait," Astrid called, but he was already in the air. Toothless shot across the cavern, his wings cutting through the air with a sharp, whistling sound. The alpha's head snapped up, its glowing eyes locking onto the Night Fury. Hiccup's heart pounded as he guided Toothless toward the pit, his mind racing. "Okay, bud," he said under his breath. "Let's make this count." Toothless let out a deafening roar, challenging the alpha. The enormous dragon bellowed in response, its massive wings unfurling as it rose to meet the challenge. Hiccup's plan had worked too well. The alpha lunged, its jaws snapping as Toothless darted out of reach. Hiccup guided the Night Fury toward the cavern entrance, the alpha in hot pursuit. "Come on," Hiccup muttered. "Just a little farther." The alpha followed them out of the cavern, its massive bulk shaking the ground with every step. As they emerged into the open air, Hiccup glanced back and felt a flicker of hope. The battle had begun. Chapter 8. The Roar of the Alpha. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the volcanic island as the colossal alpha dragon emerged from the cavern. Its massive frame shimmered like molten rock, and every step it took sent tremors through the ground. The air felt thick and electric, every breath weighted with the impending clash. Hiccup clung tightly to Toothless, the Night Fury's wings slicing through the air as they circled above the battlefield. The alpha's glowing red eyes tracked them with a predator's precision, its movements deliberate and unyielding. Around them, smaller dragons swarmed in chaotic patterns, their cries mingling with the roar of the lava-churned sea. "Okay, bud," Hiccup murmured, his voice trembling but resolute. "It's just us against the biggest dragon in existence. No pressure, right?" Toothless let out a low growl, his pupils narrowing to slits. He banked sharply, dodging a sudden burst of molten flame that erupted from the alpha's maw. The intense heat singed the air, the fiery plume lighting up the darkening sky. On the ground below, the villagers scrambled into position. Stoik led the charge, his booming voice carrying over the din of the dragon roars. "Hold your ground," he bellowed, his massive axe gleaming in the fading light. "Wait for my signal." The villagers formed a loose perimeter around the cavern's entrance, their weapons raised as they stared up at the towering alpha. Fear was etched into their faces, but so was determination. Astrid stood near the front, her axe gripped tightly in her hands. Her gaze flicked between the alpha and Hiccup, who was now swooping low to draw the beast's attention. "Hiccup," she muttered under her breath, her jaw tightening. "You'd better know what you're doing." High above, Hiccup and Toothless continued their dangerous dance with the alpha. The Night Fury unleashed a volley of plasma blasts, the glowing projectiles striking the alpha's armored hide with deafening explosions. Smoke and fire erupted with each impact, but the massive dragon barely flinched. "Nothing's working," Hiccup shouted, frustration and fear creeping into his voice. Toothless snarled in agreement, his wings straining as he climbed higher into the sky. The alpha let out a bone-rattling roar, its jaws parting to unleash another torrent of fire. Hiccup yanked on Toothless' reins, guiding the dragon into a steep dive just in time to avoid the searing blast. "We can't keep this up forever," Hiccup muttered. He glanced over his shoulder, his mind racing. They needed a plan, and fast. As they banked around for another pass, Hiccup caught sight of the smaller dragons below. They were circling aimlessly, their movements erratic and disoriented. "They're confused," Hiccup realized, a spark of hope igniting in his chest. Without the alpha's full attention, they don't know what to do. He leaned forward, his voice urgent. "Toothless, if we can keep it distracted long enough, the others might break free of its control." Toothless let out a sharp chirp, as if to say, "Let's do it." Hiccup tightened his grip on the saddle. "All right, bud. Time to get creative." On the ground, Stoic and the villagers watched in awe as Hiccup and Toothless darted through the air, their movements a blur of speed and precision. "That boy's got guts, I'll give him that," Gobber muttered, his prosthetic hand gripping a massive hammer. "He's got more than that," Astrid said, her voice low. "He's got a plan." Stoic grunted, his eyes never leaving his son. "Let's hope it's a good one." Suddenly, the alpha let out a furious roar, its massive wings unfurling as it launched itself into the air. The ground shook violently as the dragon's enormous bulk lifted off, the force of its ascent scattering rocks and debris in every direction. The villagers stumbled back, their weapons raised in alarm. "It's going after Hiccup," Astrid shouted, her heart pounding. Stoic's expression darkened. "We have to cover him." He raised his axe high, his voice a thunderous command. "Archers, fire at will." A volley of arrows shot into the sky, their tips glinting like falling stars. Most of them glanced harmlessly off the alpha's armored scales, but a few struck vulnerable spots between the plates, eliciting angry roars from the massive beast. "Keep it up," Stoic ordered. Above, Hiccup and Toothless were locked in a deadly game of cat and mouse. The alpha snapped at them with its massive jaws, each attempt narrowly missing as Toothless twisted and turned with incredible agility. "Come on, big guy," Hiccup muttered, his knuckles white as he clung to the saddle. "Stay focused on us." Toothless roared defiantly, firing another plasma blast that struck the alpha's wing. The massive dragon faltered for a moment, but its fury only seemed to grow. Then, without warning, the alpha unleashed a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very air. Hiccup winced, his ears ringing from the sound. "What the?" he began, but his words were cut off as the smaller dragons below suddenly froze. The alpha roared again, and the smaller dragons turned in unison, their eyes glowing with the same eerie red light as their masters. "No, no, no!" Hiccup shouted, realization dawning. "It's calling them back." The smaller dragons launched into the air, their movements now precise and coordinated. They swarmed toward Hiccup and Toothless, their screeches filling the sky. "This just got a lot harder," Hiccup muttered. The villagers watched in horror as the swarm of dragons filled the air, their combined shadows darkening the battlefield. "We can't let them take Hiccup," Astrid shouted, stepping forward. Stoic nodded grimly. "We hold the line. No matter what." The villagers rallied, their weapons raised as the smaller dragons began to dive toward them. The clash was immediate and brutal. Dragons swooped down, their claws raking at shields and armor, while the villagers fought back with everything they had. Astrid swung her axe with precision, driving back a pair of dragons that had lunged at her. Nearby, Gobber used his hammer to knock another dragon out of the air, his prosthetic hand flashing in the firelight. "Keep fighting," Stoic roared, his axe cleaving through the wing of a dragon that had dared to attack him. Above the chaos, Hiccup and Toothless were fighting their own battle. The swarm pressed in from all sides, forcing Toothless to perform dizzying maneuvers to avoid being overwhelmed. "This is impossible," Hiccup shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind and the cries of the dragons. Toothless growled in agreement, his movements growing more desperate as the swarm closed in. Then, in a moment of clarity, Hiccup saw it, a weak point in the alpha's armor. It was just below its neck, a small gap between the thick plates of its scales. "That's it," Hiccup exclaimed, pointing toward the weak spot. "Bud, we've got to hit that." Toothless roared in acknowledgement, his body tensing as he prepared for the attack. Hiccup gripped the reins tightly. "Okay, Bud, let's finish this." The alpha turned its attention back to Hiccup and Toothless as they dove toward it, their movements a blur of speed and determination. The smaller dragons swarmed around them, but Toothless didn't falter. He unleashed a series of plasma blasts, clearing a path through the chaos as they closed in on their target. The alpha reared back, its massive jaws opening to unleash another torrent of fire. "Now, Toothless," Hiccup shouted. The Night Fury fired a single, concentrated blast of plasma, the glowing projectile striking the alpha's weak spot with pinpoint accuracy. The resulting explosion was deafening, a blinding flash of light that lit up the sky. The alpha let out a final, earth-shaking roar before collapsing to the ground, its massive body striking the earth with a thunderous crash. The smaller dragons froze, their red eyes flickering and fading. They let out confused cries before retreating into the sky, their movements no longer coordinated. The battlefield fell silent. Hiccup and Toothless landed near the fallen alpha, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The villagers approached cautiously, their weapons lowered. Stoik stepped forward, his expression unreadable as he looked at his son. "Hiccup," he said slowly, his voice heavy with emotion. "You did it." Hiccup slid off Toothless' back, his legs trembling as he stood. "No, Dad. We did it." The villagers erupted into cheers, their relief and joy palpable. Astrid ran to Hiccup, throwing her arms around him in a fierce hug. "You're insane," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. Hiccup laughed weakly. "Yeah, I get that a lot." As the villagers began to tend to their wounded and celebrate their victory, Hiccup looked out at the horizon, where the last of the dragons were disappearing into the distance. For the first time in his life, he felt like he belonged. Chapter 9. The Bond of Peace. The battlefield lay quiet now, the echoes of the Alpha's roar fading into memory. The sun dipped low, its golden light casting long shadows across the volcanic island. A soft breeze carried the scent of salt and ash, mingling with the faint cries of retreating dragons in the distance. Hiccup stood in the center of it all, his legs trembling from exhaustion, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. Toothless pressed close to his side, the Night Fury's deep purr vibrating against Hiccup's arm, a reassurance that they had both survived the unthinkable. Around them, the villagers moved cautiously. The tension that had gripped their hearts was beginning to loosen, replaced by cautious relief and the quiet buzz of disbelief. They exchanged wide-eyed looks and murmured words, their weapons still clutched tightly, though now more from habit than necessity. Stoik approached slowly, his massive frame silhouetted against the flickering glow of the dying sun. His axe hung loosely in his hand, and his face was a mixture of pride and something far softer. His gaze lingered on Toothless before shifting to his son. "Well," Stoik said, his deep voice cutting through the quiet. "That was unexpected." Hiccup gave a weak laugh, leaning heavily on Toothless. "That's one way to put it." Stoik looked at the fallen Alpha, its massive form sprawled across the volcanic rock. The once glowing red eyes were now dull and lifeless, its body steaming faintly as it began to cool. "You brought down a creature that could have destroyed us all," Stoik said, his tone both incredulous and proud. "And you did it with a dragon by your side." Hiccup straightened, meeting his father's gaze. "We didn't have a choice. Fighting fire with fire wasn't going to work. It never does." Stoik studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You were right. And I was wrong." The words hung in the air, heavy with significance. Hiccup blinked, surprised by the admission, but before he could respond, Astrid stepped forward. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice breaking the silence that had fallen over the group. All eyes turned to Stoik. He glanced at the villagers, who were still tense and wary, their gazes darting between the remaining dragons circling far above and Toothless, who sat calmly beside Hiccup. Stoik took a deep breath. "Now we go home. and we figure out how to live with what we've learned. The journey back to Berk was slow and somber, the villagers too drained to celebrate their victory. The longships moved steadily across the open sea, their sails full of the cold evening wind. Hiccup sat at the bow of the lead ship, his thoughts spinning like the restless waves beneath them. Toothless lay curled at his feet, his tail swishing lazily as he basked in the quiet. Astrid sat beside him, her axe resting on her knees. She nudged him gently with her elbow. "You okay?" she asked. Hiccup shrugged. "I don't know. I mean, we won, but did we really? We killed the alpha, but there's still so much we don't understand. The dragons didn't choose to fight us, they were being controlled. And now that control is gone, what happens to them?" Astrid tilted her head, considering his words. Maybe they go back to being what they were before. Animals trying to survive. Or maybe they find another alpha, Hiccup said, his voice heavy with worry. What if this isn't over? Astrid reached out, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Then we'll deal with it. Together. Hiccup looked at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. Thanks, Astrid. She smiled back. Anytime. When the ships finally reached Berk, it was nearly midnight. The villagers disembarked silently, their movements slow and weary. The fires in the village had been left to burn low, casting long shadows across the familiar landscape. As Hiccup stepped onto the dock, Toothless following close behind, he was struck by how different the village felt. It was the same place he had always known, but everything about it seemed to have shifted. The villagers who remained on the island emerged from their homes, their faces etched with concern. They froze when they saw Toothless, their expressions shifting to fear and confusion. Stoik raised a hand, his booming voice cutting through the murmurs. Hold your ground. This dragon is not our enemy. The crowd hesitated, their eyes darting between Stoik and the Night Fury. Hiccup stepped forward, his heart pounding. Toothless helped save us. He's the reason we're all still standing. There was a long pause, and then one of the villagers, a young woman with a bough slung over her shoulder, spoke up. If that's true, then why are we still afraid? Hiccup took a deep breath. Because fear is easy. It's safe. But it's not the answer. We've spent so long fighting dragons that we forgot to ask why they're fighting us. Toothless showed me that they're not monsters. They're just trying to survive, like us. The crowd murmured again, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and curiosity. Stoik stepped forward, his voice firm. My son speaks the truth. Today we fought alongside a dragon. And because of that, we're here to tell the tale. The villagers exchanged glances, their fear slowly giving way to cautious interest. Gobber stepped up, his grin lopsided but genuine. Well, if Stoik the Vast is vouching for a dragon, I suppose I can give it a shot. The crowd chuckled nervously, the tension beginning to ease. Over the next few days, the village of Berk began to change in ways Hiccup had never imagined. The dragons that had once terrorized their shores now circled above the island, their movements hesitant but peaceful. Toothless became a constant presence in the village, his playful antics slowly winning over the wary villagers. Hiccup took it upon himself to bridge the gap between the two worlds. He spent hours observing the dragons, sketching their behaviors and sharing his findings with anyone willing to listen. Astrid, Gobber, and even Stoik joined him in his efforts, their support lending weight to his words. Slowly but surely, the villagers began to see the dragons not as enemies, but as potential allies. One evening, as the sun set over the island, Hiccup stood on a cliff overlooking the sea. Toothless sat beside him, his tail swishing lazily as they watched the horizon. It's not perfect, Hiccup said softly, his gaze distant. But it's a start. Astrid appeared behind him, her footsteps light on the rocky ground. You've done more than anyone thought possible. You've changed everything. Hiccup smiled faintly. I didn't do it alone. Astrid rested a hand on his arm. No, but you led the way. And that's what matters. Hiccup looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. Thanks, Astrid. She smiled, her eyes bright. Always. As the stars began to fill the night sky, Hiccup felt a sense of hope he hadn't known in years. Berk was no longer just a village of dragon hunters. It was becoming something new, something better. And for the first time, Hiccup truly believed that peace was possible. Chapter 10. A New Dawn for Berk. The first light of dawn broke over the island of Berk, bathing its rocky shores and humble village in a warm golden glow. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of salt and smoke, remnants of the battle that had forever changed their lives. As the villagers stirred from their homes, a new sound filled the morning. A symphony of dragon calls, melodic and strange, echoing across the cliffs. Hiccup stood atop a ridge overlooking the village, Toothless by his side. The night fury's sharp eyes scanned the horizon, his tail flicking in contentment. Below, dragons of every size and color perched on rooftops and roamed among the villagers, their movements tentative but peaceful. For centuries, the people of Berk had known dragons only as destroyers, beasts to be feared and fought. Now they were learning to see them as something else entirely. Allies, companions, friends. We've come a long way, haven't we, bud? Hiccup said, reaching out to scratch Toothless behind the ears. Toothless purred in response, leaning into the touch. Behind them, footsteps crunched against the rocky path. Hiccup turned to see Astrid approaching, her axe slung over her back and her hair tied back in a loose braid. "Thought I'd find you up here," she said with a smile, stopping beside him. "You've been spending a lot of time brooding on cliffs lately." Hiccup smirked. "It's not brooding. It's reflecting." Astrid raised an eyebrow. "Uh-huh. And what are you reflecting on this time?" Hiccup gestured to the village below. "Just all of it. How much has changed? How much still needs to change? It feels like we've barely scratched the surface." Astrid followed his gaze, her expression softening. "It's going to take time, Hiccup. But look at what you've already done. The village isn't just surviving anymore, it's starting to thrive. And that's because of you." Hiccup shook his head. "It's because of us. Everyone here is making this work, not just me." Astrid nudged him playfully with her elbow. "Fine. Be humble about it. But don't forget to give yourself some credit, too." As the day unfolded, the village buzzed with activity. The people of Berk had begun integrating dragons into their daily lives, though not without challenges. Fishlegs stood at the docks, meticulously cataloging the different dragon species that had settled in the area. His notebook was already filled with sketches and notes, but he kept flipping pages, his enthusiasm boundless. "This one's a gronkle," he announced to a small group of villagers, pointing to a pudgy, rock-like dragon that was lazily sunning itself. "They're incredibly strong and have a diet that consists mostly of rocks. Just don't try to ride one without proper padding." Nearby, Gobber was busy adapting his smithy to accommodate dragons. A monstrous nightmare sat beside the forge, its tail flicking dangerously close to the flames. "Oi, watch the tail," Gobber barked, waving a hammer at the dragon. "You set this place on fire, and you're the one putting it out." The dragon snorted a puff of smoke, but it seemed to understand, moving its tail away from the forge. Stoic, too, was adjusting to the new reality. He walked through the village with his usual commanding presence, though his interactions with the dragons were more cautious. At one point, he stopped to observe a group of children playing with a small, feathered dragon. The beast chirped and flapped its tiny wings as the kids laughed and cheered. Stoic's expression softened, a rare smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Hiccup spent most of the day working with Toothless, fine-tuning the dragon's prosthetic tail. They were interrupted when Snotlout swaggered over, Hookfong in tow. "So," Snotlout said, crossing his arms, "when do I get my custom saddle? Hookfong and I are ready for some serious aerial stunts." Hiccup rolled his eyes. "You mean serious crashing? Hey, I've got skills," Snotlout protested. "To be fair," Astrid interjected, walking up with Stormfly, "you've gotten better." "Marginally." Snotlout puffed out his chest. "I'll take that as a compliment." Hiccup chuckled, shaking his head. "Fine, I'll help you with a saddle. But only if you promise to follow the safety instructions this time." "No promises," Snotlout called over his shoulder as he walked away. As evening approached, the village gathered in the great hall for a feast. Long tables were laden with roasted meats, fresh fish, and hearty stews. The air was filled with laughter and the clatter of mugs and plates. Dragons perched along the edges of the hall, their presence no longer alarming but welcome. Some of the smaller ones even wandered among the tables, sniffing curiously at the food. Stoic stood at the head of the hall, raising his mug for a toast. "To Berk," he roared, "and to the brave souls who made this day possible." The hall erupted in cheers, the sound echoing off the wooden beams. Hiccup, sitting near the middle of the room, felt a surge of pride and warmth. For the first time, he felt truly at home, not just in the village, but in his own skin. Astrid leaned over, her voice low. "They're finally seeing what I've seen all along." Hiccup smiled at her, his heart swelling. "Thanks, Astrid. For everything." She grinned. "You can thank me by not brooding on cliffs tomorrow." Later that night, Hiccup and Toothless climbed to their favorite spot overlooking the village. The stars were bright, their light reflecting off the calm sea. Hiccup lay back on the grass, his hands behind his head. Bud, I think we've done something pretty amazing here. But I also think this is just the beginning. Toothless curled up beside him, letting out a soft, contented hum. Hiccup gazed up at the stars, his mind filled with possibilities. For the first time in his life, he felt like he truly understood his place in the world. And he couldn't wait to see what came next. As the tale winds to its close, dear listener, I offer my gratitude for walking this journey with me. If you've enjoyed the story, don't let it end here. Share it with others who might find wonder in these words. Leave your thoughts to keep the dialogue alive, and subscribe so you won't miss the next adventure waiting just beyond the horizon. Until we meet again, thank you for being part of the story.